Welcome back to the forum. The keynote address will now be delivered by Professor Tariq Modood, who is Professor of Sociology, Politics and Public Policy, as well as the founding director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship at the University of Bristol. Professor Modood is a highly distinguished scholar in the fields of racism, multiculturalism, and secularism. With over 35 years of research expertise, he has contributed to furthering our understanding of ethnic and national identities, held multiple grants and consultancies, and published extensively. He was awarded Member of the Order of the British Empire for his contributions to social sciences and ethnic relations, and is both a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK and a Fellow of the British Academy. He has also served on the Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain and on the National Equality Panel in the UK. Please join me in welcoming Professor Modood on stage.
Hello. I'm very pleased to be here, and so thank you to the organizers, and in particular to Professor Matthew Matthews for inviting me, and to his wonderful staff for facilitating everything from the word go to this moment. Speaking to you after you've heard so many interesting, informed and theoretically based talks, I thought, my goodness, will I be able to say anything that you haven't already heard? So this is actually quite a bit of a challenge to me. But nevertheless, even if I don't manage to say something that is totally new to the discussions today, I hope I might be able to give it my own take, my own sense of how certain concepts and issues that we're all concerned with across the world, how they hang together. So, let's see. So, there's the title, and the importance of the first word of the title, understanding. Because before we can talk about causes and remedies, mitigations and so on, we have to have an understanding of what the issues are. And of course, that's been happening all day. But if you like, I'm going to focus even more on what I see as understanding rather than telling you what I think the causes of the problem are and how we can get beyond them. Though, of course, that's what we can do in the Q&A afterwards. The subtitle has this word, Euro-American centricity. It's a bit of a mouthful. Hopefully, its meaning will emerge as we go along. I'll certainly explain it before the end. And as you'll see, I flagged up that this talk's based on a paper that I wrote with Thomas Seeley, and which Professor Matthews said fitted the theme of this event very well. So here you have it. What I'm going to do is to start with the concepts I already work with, and if you like, suggesting that here are some ideas, both social science ideas and political ideas, that have originated in the West generally, or in Britain specifically in my case, and then think about how those ideas can, as it were, travel to this region. Are they helpful? To what extent? What adaptations should be made? And what new ideas emerge, which are, as it were, emerging more organically from the different societies of this region, and so have a better fit. So, for me, the most relevant idea is that of racisms. Now, you'll see that I think the single most important thing on the slide is the letter S in the title. Racisms. That's very important and actually quite new. When I say new, I mean, just a few decades old, because traditionally people tended to perhaps without giving it enough thought, but tended to think that racism was basically one kind of thing, whereas now we certainly don't think that's the case. Just thinking about my country and neighboring countries like France or Germany and so on, we obviously have color racism. Everybody understands that, and if you like, that's one of the critical historic meanings of racism. Anti-Semitism, obviously, is a very long-standing racism in Europe. In fact, in Germany, the term, perhaps slightly less so now, but for many decades, certainly across most of the 20th century, the German word Rassismus, actually, if you use that term, people would think about anti-Semitism. They wouldn't think about color racism, but color racism, of course, is the meaning in the Anglophone Atlantic world when we talk about racism. And then I've got here more recent contemporary phenomena in a country like Britain and France. Paki bashing, a term you may or may not understand, certainly describing racist attacks on people who look like me, usually younger people, and so it's the kind of thing I experienced when I was a boy and a teenager, and I hope its meaning is clear. Anti-Asian more generally, anti-Asian racism, racism directed at people perceived to be Asian. And in Britain, unlike in Asia, perhaps, and certainly unlike the United States, when we say Asian, we nearly always mean South Asian. In the US, when they say Asian, they mean East Asian. So I'm a pretty prototypical British Asian. In France, one of the strongest racisms in contemporary France is anti-Arab racism. So again, that's different from just color racism, different from anti-Semitism and others. And then think about what, just a few decades ago, journalists called ethnic cleansing. At the time of the wars in Yugoslavia, the civil wars, the ethnic cleansing of Bosnian Muslims. And why that's a form of racism is because when the Serbian militias, when they arrived at a Bosnian Muslim village or town and rounded up all the men and all the women and were sent on different buses somewhere else, but the men often ended up killed or in concentration camps, how did they know who was a Muslim? How did they know who to round up? Unlike the Spanish Inquisition, they didn't ask anyone, what do you believe? They didn't ask them about Allah. They didn't ask them about the Quran. They were a Muslim because they lived in that community. So that's really a form of racism. And so I conclude at the bottom of that slide that racism in general, not always, but in general, is not about genetics. It's about identifying people in terms of culture or community. And so I call this phenomenon cultural racism. And I add something in brackets there when I say it's not a proxy, because other people also have theories of cultural racism. In fact, Yoko referred to some, very well referred to some European theories of cultural racism at the start of her talk, for instance, when she referred to Etienne Balibar. So people who follow Balibar in Britain, they argue that cultural racism is a proxy for what they think is true racism, which they think is to do with biology and color. So the quote that Yoko gave from Balibar said that culture can stand in to function for nature. That's not my view. My view is that cultural racism is a racism in its own right. It's not a quasi-racism because it approximates to something else to do with biology. So we must break the link between racism and biology. Of course, there can be biological racism. I've got color racism right at the top of my list. But it doesn't exhaust the field of racisms. And most racisms in the world, in this region and in the world in general, are actually not about biology. So what is racism then? Let's say a bit more about that. So it's now quite commonplace in British social science to talk about racialization, and I think we had some of that earlier as well, including in talking about Japan, for instance. So to talk about racialization means to talk about a social process or sets of processes, socio-historical processes. It doesn't mean that you have to examine anything natural like biology, genetics, DNA, and so on. But there has to be some physical element for it to be racialization. We can't just pick up any group of people and say that what I'm about to go through this list, oh, that's a form of racism, because groups are formed by other kinds of categories, like obviously gender, class. So we must be able to identify racialization, which is its own kind of group formation, group categorization, which we can distinguish from gender and class and so on. So this is how I make the distinction, the differentiation, by referring to three features. Firstly, descent. So who were your parents, grandparents, your ancestors, and so on. That's what I mean by descent. So we identify people by descent. So when we say that someone is British Asian, we mean that they are descended from people who come from Asia, specifically from South Asia. But, as I put in brackets there, we don't mean anything biological in terms of determinism. Historically, there have been theories of racism in the 18th, 19th, and indeed the 20th century, like, for instance, the Nazi theories about the Jews, that believed it was something to do with their biology, and that their biology determines their behavior or their lack of civilization or their lack of intelligence. That's not necessary to racism, and it's not necessary to descent. All we do is identify people by their physical appearance. So that's a very superficial form of biology. It doesn't involve any determinism. Secondly, we say of this group that it is an other, and we not just say it, I mean we treat them as an other, i.e. they're not really us, they're somebody else. Even if they live in the same street as us, work in the same workplaces as us, part of our society, we make them into something else. We are one people, they are something outside us. They are an other. One of the ways that sociologists, some sociologists and theorists identify this kind of othering, this process, is they say, oh, what we're doing when we do this is we're saying all people who belong to group X, or even most people who belong to group X, behave in a certain kind of way or have certain kinds of characteristics. We don't really, I don't think that's sociologically correct, even though this is what you'll find in the literature. Racists often make exceptions. You know, we know the old trope about my best friend is black, but this is what I think about black people. So even hard-edged racists make exceptions. Nobody makes total generalizations, and even the most is not necessary. So a lot of people talking about Islamophobia say, oh, one of the tropes of Islamophobia is that all or most Muslims are fanatics, are terrorists. Well, actually, I don't think many people believe that. They do believe that Islam, fanaticism, and terrorism have some kind of interrelationship, but they don't think that most Muslims are fanatics, or put it another way, they don't have to believe that in order to be Islamophobes. They can have Islamophobic attitudes without that. So I think it's probably enough to say that the attributes that we are giving to the other, we say they are disproportionately something. They're disproportionately less intelligent than us. They disproportionately have a propensity to violence compared to us or compared to other people. Or they have a tendency to react in a certain kind of way. You know, you mention their religion and they get all very excited and agitated and potentially violent and hostile and so on. So othering is picking out some kind of attributes in other people, but it's not saying that every member of the group has that attribute, rather that those attributes are linked to those groups in some significant socio-historical way. And then thirdly, these groups, these characteristics of groups, are negatively evaluated. We don't say racism's taking place when groups are being, as it were, praised. Though certain kinds of praising, like saying of certain groups that they're very clever or very good with money and so on, of course, is a form of putting them down, is a form of saying, oh, be careful with them, don't trust them, or they're trying to take over society and so on. So that is a negative evaluation. And these three features of what I call racialization applies to discourses, images, practices, institutions. So it's a very, very general, all-encompassing concept. At the bottom, I've got here, plus power to make it stick. So some of you will know, we don't hear it nowadays, but we used to say, hear it in the past, people used to say, racism is prejudice plus power. You know, a three-word solution, a three-word definition. So some people say that. That's not my view. I think powerless people can be racists. There's a sense in which nobody is ever totally powerless. They may be powerless in certain contexts, but not in others. Powerless against certain kinds of groups, but then they got their own other groups who they keep down. And some of those people might even be members of their own groups and so on. So I don't think only powerful people can be racists. I think we all can be racist, however powerful, powerless we are, whatever those dynamics are. And so I've got in brackets here plus capitalism, because that's another thing that social theorists in the West tend to say. They seem to say racism is a product of capitalism, or capitalism needs racism in order to carry out global exploitation, in order to extract, you know, labor value from subaltern populations and so on. I don't think that's part of the definition of racism or racialization. Of course, that's a historical process. It's a fact. It's happened and happens, but it's not necessary to racism. So when we're looking for racism, we shouldn't be thinking, oh, what kind of capitalism exists here? How is this linked to capitalism? That's a wild goose chase. We don't have to do that. So just thinking about Britain for a minute, one of the things I started to do was to think about how there could be racism without without a black group. So in the US, racism's always thought in terms of black and white, and to some extent in Britain, we also, less so now, but we also began to think in those ways, sometimes directly influenced by what was happening in the United States. So for instance, a lot of anti-racists thought that the UK population could be divided into two, black or white. And they thought I was black. And I said, no, I'm not. And they didn't like that. And I said, well, isn't it a bit racist to not allow me to define myself? And they said, no, you must be black. So, yeah, okay, we have more or less got beyond that. Not quite. There's a lot of good that's come out of the Black Lives Matter movement from the United States, and it's energized anti-racism all across the world, certainly in Britain. But one of the negative things it's done, including in Britain, is it's reinforced this black-white dualism, that racism's only about how white people treat black people. No, it's not. It's much wider than that. And here are some more examples, some of which I've already really discussed. Cultural racism against Arabs, for instance, Islamophobia. But one that I haven't mentioned before is that in Britain, we have racisms against Eastern Europeans, Poles, Czechs, Romanians, and so on. And in fact, that was a significant factor in our Brexit vote. One of the main reasons that Brexit won was because some people wanted to stop the freedom of movement of European peoples coming from the European Union into Britain. They didn't mind Germans or French or Dutch, they were very nice people, or Swedes, even Spaniards, yeah, they're okay, Italians, they're okay. But Eastern Europeans, no, we don't want too many of those people. So white people can be racist about other white people. So that's another way that we can break out of this black-white biological binary. So what about outside Europe, and in particular in this region? So I've got a lot on this slide, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each item. These are all examples to show that there can be racism without black-white, and some of it you'll recognize. Some of it's already been discussed during the day. People have given informed presentations about them. Like Arab anti-Semitism. There was a time when anti-Semitism was thought of as a particularly European disease, as a European problem. But of course, we know that's not true. Other people can be anti-Semitic as well. And I've got an example here of Arab anti-Semitism because it can be particularly virulent, but I think actually I could have chosen lots of different other kinds of groups and from other parts of the world. The paper that I've been drawing on that I mentioned right at the start was an introduction to a special issue about racisms and anti-racisms in Asia and the Middle East. And so most of the things I'm going to mention on this slide are from that paper, from that special issue, which included a paper by Sonia Sikka on Islamophobia in India. Now, what is interesting is that Islamophobia is a concept developed in the West, and Britain's played a leading role in developing that concept. And yet now we find we can use it all over the world. And there are lots of people who have done extremely good theoretical analysis and empirical and historical studies about Islamophobia all over the world, including in India, where it has been particularly harsh in the last decade, last 2 decades, and so on, linked, of course, to the BJP, the ruling party, and its project of Hindutva, India as just a Hindu nation. So that's good. I mean, that's interesting because it shows that we have a concept here that can do some travel. It can move from Britain to India. People find it useful in talking about their experiences in India. And a lot of people would, 20 years ago, some people even today, say, how can one be a racist towards Muslims? Muslims are not a race. But I hope I've said enough to persuade you that that's really a very superficial response. After all, Jews aren't a race, and nobody doubts we can be racist to Jews. So racialization, as in the case of Bosnia, can pick out a group of people, but certainly by referring to their religion or ethnicity or where they live, but above all, related to their descent. So yes, we can have Islamophobia in India. In this special issue, we also had a paper on the Chinese state's treatment of Uyghurs. Gerald Roche and James Rybold had a paper which very interestingly was based on leaked police files. showing how the police understood the Uyghurs in highly racialized ways as categories of people who behave in certain kinds of ways. We also had a paper on anti-Chinese racism in Malaysia. And we heard a little bit about that this morning. And I've got in brackets here, compare Indonesia, because we also had a paper from Taufiq Tansaladi, who of course gave a presentation here after lunch, showing how something similar has now also been taking place in Indonesia, though it was almost state policy. It was practiced through state structures in the earlier period of Indonesian independence. But since 1998, the political elite has been trying to dismantle state racism. Nevertheless, popular racism against Chinese, sometimes linked to what Taufiq called conservative Islamic movements, can be found in society, even where the state's trying to fight against it. As Taufiq's here, I hope I haven't misrepresented him. He'll tell me later if I have. We had a paper on Christians in Pakistan, another religious group that can be racialized and can be treated as a race by Muslim Pakistanis. Christians, some of you may not be aware of this, because Christians on the whole are privileged people in most societies that we know about, but in Pakistan, they're absolutely the bottom of the pile. And despite Islam saying there's no such thing as caste and so on, actually in Pakistan, they are treated as a low caste, I should say, or untouchable people, as are indeed Dalits in India. And we have a paper that connects that to the to the UK and to the USA. And I've got in brackets, compare Martin Luther King, because actually Martin Luther King was made a very big argument about how the way that black people are treated in the United States is as if they were a caste, as if they were untouchable. And he wasn't just being metaphorical, he was directly talking about the caste system in Indian society. We also had a paper on anti-Palestinian racism and one or two others, but I can see with time running out, I should not necessarily go through them all, but go to the last 2 points I want to make. So, what are they? With so many different kinds of racialization, I suppose one could ask, well, are some more important than others? That seems to be a reasonable thing to ask. Are some more worthy of our attention than others? But there are some social theorists and political activists in Britain and elsewhere who say, no, we shouldn't ask that question, and we shouldn't answer the question with a yes. And they say because there is no hierarchy of racism. All racisms are equally bad, and to think otherwise is to be a racist against certain people. I don't share that view, and I'll explain what I mean. So with the first bullet point, I do want to emphasize there's no essential or inherent hierarchy of racisms. So it isn't the case that some people's racialization is more than others, or they're kind of more fitting to be racialized or anything like that. No, all racisms are racisms. We don't want to kind of rank humanity into who is the best or indeed who is the worst, because you could have a competitive victimization here. My racism is worse than your racism, and so on. And this is one of the reasons, one of the practical, pragmatic reasons that anti-racists say, don't ask the question about are some racisms more important than others. But I think we can't leave it there, because there has to be some kind of prioritization, especially when we're thinking about policy as we are in this forum. And Prioritization, therefore, must be based on the scale of the problem, the number of people affected, the urgency of the problem. And this will vary from time to time and place to place. So it's not an essential hierarchy in terms of like a global humankind hierarchy. An example I've mentioned here is in the United States for decades, and in Britain now also we're doing it, universities offer scholarships only to black people, meaning people of African descent, but via the West Indies possibly or whatever, but people of African descent. So Chinese people or people of Indian descent or Pakistani descent and so on aren't eligible to apply for those. And we don't think that's racist, because we think, well, actually, that's where the need is. Chinese people, people of Indian origin, even people of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin are well represented in higher education. They don't need special targeted scholarships, but black people do. And so we prioritize black people in this particular context. So that's what I mean. And I think to not prioritize may be naive or itself a sign of racism. And I think this is where we are in this country. I know I'm going to have to stop in a minute. This is where we are in Britain. If you compare how our government, our politicians, and our media treat anti-Semitism compared to Islamophobia. In my opinion, but I don't think it's just an opinion, I think there's loads of evidence to support it, Islamophobia is much the greater problem, but our politicians, our government, and the media act as if anti-Semitism is the greater problem. So my very last slide, and then I will stop, because I feel I need to explain to you what I said I would about the term beyond Euro-American centricity. One of the things that we're rightly now preoccupied with, especially when we think about how ideas from the North are suitable for the South or not suitable for the South, is decolonization. And I think what I've been talking about can be understood as a kind of second step in decolonization, in intellectual decolonization. So the first step is seeing how the South, or the non-West if you like, has been dominated, shaped, and misrecognized by the North. And that's now quite a big preoccupation in social sciences and humanities, in British universities, American universities, and so on. But that's only the first step. It's not the whole project. It should not be the whole project. I think there's a second step, which is seeing the South, or the non-West, without privileging the prism of the North, including internal South-to-South relations, like all the ones we've heard about today. And those relations, antagonisms, empires, and racisms, as well as, of course, positive contributions that different groups are making within their own countries and regions and so on. So the first step, as if some people act as if all that's important, is how the South relates to the North, to its concepts, or how the North treats the South. But both steps are necessary if we're to take the concept of decolonization seriously and are to understand racism, ethnic hierarchy, ethnic conflict, and prejudice beyond a Western black-white dominant perspective. Thank you. I will stop.
Thank you, Professor Modood. The Q&A session will now begin. If you would like to ask Professor Modood a question, please use the standing microphones or scan the QR code on your tables with your mobile devices. Moderating this Q&A session will be Dr. Teo K. Kee, Research Fellow at IPS Social Lab, who will join Professor Modood on stage. Dr. Teo, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I know we are the final obstacle between you guys and the end of the session, so we'll try to make this an interesting last part for your afternoon. So I think we have heard very rich stories today. The entire day through all the different panels. And I think Prof. Tariq has given us a very nice discussion to cap it all off, because we have gone back to the roots of what is racism and what is discrimination, right? So I think it's very interesting that you also mentioned that, no one is completely without power. So, and it's, I did some homework on you as well, and I realized that you have had quite a lot of experience also in policy work. So perhaps my first question, before I go to anybody else on the online session, and I also encourage people to come up to the mics later to address us directly, is really to move the focus a bit more to policy and maybe the ground more. So what I would like to ask is really, in Singapore we have a multiracial, multicultural society, and we talk about things like tolerance, about accommodation, and about understanding and acceptance. So, all these concepts, tolerance, accommodation, and acceptance, what do you think about them, especially in terms of, applied to a society like this?
Yeah. Thank you, Keiki. I think there are important distinctions between respect and tolerance. Tolerance is a good thing if you can't get respect, but it's not enough. The historical roots of toleration come from when, going back to the division in Europe, this going back a few centuries, the division in Europe between Catholics and Protestants. First of all, they tried to wipe out each other. And they did actually wipe out large populations. But then they were exhausted, and they thought, well, we just got to find a way of living together. So they came up with a formula which said that the ruler of each country shall choose the religion for their country, usually their own religions, Protestant or Catholic. But they will tolerate the other religions. Tolerate meaning they won't kill them, they won't persecute them, but not necessarily treat them with equality. In fact, they certainly didn't treat them with equality for centuries. But respect is really a very recent modern concept. Respect for individuals and the dignity of individuals has a longer historical record, but respect for groups, I would say, really is, there's certain kinds of histories, but as a theoretical idea, I would say that it's really just from the middle of the 20th century. And it's part of the idea of multiculturalism. So a lot of people have an organizing frame in which, they think, their theory, if you like. For a lot of people, it's anti-racism or post-colonialism or all about social cohesion and so on. My theoretical organizing frame is multiculturalism. And perhaps one of the key ideas of multiculturalism is to take the concept of equal citizenship and say that this is a very important concept, and that the way that it's been historically developed, meaning everybody to be treated the same, no one to be discriminated against, no one to be privileged, is a very good, important concept which we mustn't lose. But equality is more than that, because people belong to groups. And as we've seen, and as the talk about racialization, groups can be treated very unequally. And people want to be respected as members of their group. They don't just want to be treated equally if they leave their group behind, which was actually what the French revolutionaries promised the Jews, whether they carried it out. But anyway, as a theoretical idea, they said to the Jews, we'll give you equal French citizenship, and this was a big forward step, no one else was offering it, will give you equal French citizenship as long as you don't aspire to be part of what they call the Jewish nation. If you leave your group behind, you just become French, what we call assimilation. Assimilation is really a form of inequality because it says to other people, I can be a citizen without doing anything, but you can only be a citizen by becoming more like me. So that's fundamental inequality. And that's the inequality that multiculturalism focuses on. And so it takes the classical liberal idea of toleration, non-discrimination, equal treatment, and it takes it to saying we must respect people as members of the groups that they say that they're members of. And I think that is the fundamental difference between respect and tolerance.
Okay, so basically everybody does equal amounts of work to become one nation in that sense.
I don't know whether it'd be equal amount of work, but let's say all parties have to do some work.
Okay, so we all contribute in some way. I see some top voted questions, but I will go with the more related ones first. So there's one question that is asking, what is the purpose to conflate discrimination against religion with biological racism under one umbrella of cultural racism?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't think I'm conflating them. Conflating them is where you take two things and you blur the difference between them. I'm saying that racism isn't just about biology, and the reason that we think it is just about biology, or used to think it was just about biology, it's because of our history. Because in the Atlantic world and in Europe, these biological theories about superiority, about the supremacy of white people, about the inferiority of Jews, about the inferiority of Africans, of Asians, brown or yellow, you know, that's some of the most powerful forms of racism that we know about in our modern history, modern global history. So that's why we think, oh, racism is all about biology. I'm saying racism isn't about biology. There are racisms, some of them are more biologically rooted, but actually the majority of them are more like what I called cultural racisms. So I'm not conflating the two, but what I am doing is I am learning from how we have been analyzing biology-based differential treatment and extending it so that we can understand other forms of differential treatment. So, yeah, so I'm extending the concept of racism, not conflating it with biology.
Okay, because we do recognize different types of differences nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I'll move on to a bit of a question, but before that, I would like to, yes, I see our speaker from the previous one.
That's right. I took off my jacket to get warm. It's getting to some hot debate, and I had some of that with Matthew's group, but I'm warning more, it's a very cold place.
I know, I totally agree.
Professor, I mean, a lot of things you said resonate with what I do, and with your eminence on this topic. It's just your concept of racism, your concept of multiculturalism sits very well and neatly with what my understanding would be. The question I have is more in relation to racism that's defined in its current usage, and it's always a black and white issue, right? And I mean, I'm told, you know, it's black and white, and so, but I'm yellow, but it doesn't matter, you're black for today, because that's the way it works. But for me, the question is this, I mean, it's Kishore Mahbubani, eminent Singaporean, wrote the book called Can Asians Think? By extension, I want to ask the question, can Asians be racist? Because that's never been the repertoire. We can't be racist. And even when I've seen the worst racism coming from Asians to Asians, in dealing with Islamophobia, for example, in Australia, to take recognition of the fact that there are more Asians who hate Muslims than there are whites, and yet it's never talked about. It's almost like you can't betray your own. If you start taking that up as a topic, then you give the white the license to treat us differently, because they say, well, you guys are as bad as we are, we're not the racists. So they'd like to keep it to white and black, but I think it does a lot of injustice to us to understand racism for what it is. It can permeate to every quarter. So my question would be, can Asians be, and I know the answer, can Asians be racist? And why aren't we defining it in a way that materially sits in the same place with black and white racism? Because we call it different names. We call it ethnic tensions, ethnic hostilities, but it's never racism. So my view is how do we redefine this to mean what it means? And the power equation is terribly important, because I know of Asians in Australia, African youth who said, I hate the whites, but I cannot be racist because I got no power to negatively affect them. As if racism is only because I can do something to them. If I didn't, then it's not racism. So the question is, can Asians be racist, and why aren't we defining it in a way that says we are just as bad, or can, in fact, improve our understanding about interracial issues?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, yes. So it's nice to be asked a question that you already know the answer to. That's good. Yeah, so I agree with you. Of course, Asians can be racist. So my family is from Pakistan, so that I'm not accused of putting down anyone else, I'll just talk about Pakistanis. Yeah, Pakistanis can be racists. They can be racists against black people. They can be racists against white people. They can be racists against yellow people, and so on. So one of the sources of this, of course, of not wanting to emphasize this in the countries, in white majority countries like Australia or Britain, one of the reasons for not wanting to do this is, of course, we're very conscious of the history of colonial domination based on divide and rule. And we think, well, come on, we're trying to stand up for our rights, and we're more likely to succeed if we work together than start pointing fingers at each other. And while there's some genuine truth in that, there are two ways that I think that it's not satisfactory. Leaving aside any kind of intellectual issues here, just two political, practical ways that I think it's not satisfactory. Firstly, if British Pakistanis were socialized into believing that only other people or only white people are racists, they would never examine their own racism. And that's not good for Pakistanis, and it's not good for people that Pakistanis are racists about. And you may say, well, Pakistanis don't have much power over other people, but there are contexts where they do. In certain neighborhoods, in certain towns, in certain businesses, and so on. And the other negative feature is, and this actually relates to something I said in my talk when I said there was a time in Britain when it was said that if you aren't white, you're black, because that's the only two options available. That was not a kind of intellectual position. It was very much a political activist position, because they said, we all got to unite and work together, so they think we're rubbish because of our color of our skin or whatever, so let's just all say we're all black. And in a way, it's a little bit like the African Americans who, after having been told, we won't call you black, we'll call you colored because it's polite, turned round and said, well, F you, we're black and proud. But it didn't work in Britain, and I won't go into all the reasons why not. But so we obviously must form alliances with other people, because no political project is possible without mobilization, without consensus building, and so on. But I think it actually then creates a different problem, which is to think that the boundaries of the coalition are defined by color. There are lots of white people who are anti-racist, some of them a lot more anti-racist than some brown people I know. Why can't they be part of an anti-racist coalition? So I think this idea that if you're of color, you know, people of color, you are naturally one political constituency and all other people are outside that constituency, I think it's bad politics, and it generates a certain kind of unchallenged racism amongst some parts of minorities.
Thank you. So perhaps, there's another question there.
Hi, Professor. Jacqueline Neal from NUS Law. I will not ask a law question, but generally I have some a sort of persistent question in my mind concerning racism and how we talk about race. So growing up, I used to watch reruns of Mr. Brown, the English teacher who has all these different racial students from different countries and how they manage. And the funny thing about that show is that it builds on cultural stereotypes, right? Yeah. And then fast forward later on, you have shows like Goodness Gracious Me, again, another British sitcom, which talks about cultural stereotypes, but sort of making fun of themselves. So my question is, these are all, comedies that are, they speak to a certain reality, but they also raise a very important question that we have today in this wokeness culture, which we mentioned earlier, about how do we talk about race without being racist? So, you have a particular definition of racism, but I'm wondering how do we move on from that definition to talk about race in an open manner without being racist? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yes, this is something actually I have done some work on. I have thought about it. And it's always struck me as odd that it's something that very few scholars of racism or anti-racists even ask themselves. So I asked myself this question in one specific location, and that was in relation to Islamophobia. Because a lot of people in Britain and elsewhere say, well, look, certain things about Islam are all wrong. How and when can we say that out loud without being called an Islamophobe? And I think they have a point. Muslims are always saying what's wrong with Islam and so on. So, it can't be, everything about us as Muslims and so on can't be perfect. It must be open to discussion and so on, without it being denounced as Islamophobia. So I said, well, take this proposition and let's kind of think about it. So the proposition I chose was Muslim views about women are inappropriate for modern Britain. And the question then is this Islamophobic, or is it what I'll call reasonable criticism? Reasonable criticism is not the same thing as it's true. Reasonable criticism, we discuss things when someone raises a critical point. So the first part of the very first step of my response is there's nothing about the sentence itself that tells you whether it's Islamophobic or not. So we must know something more about the context and about the uses of the sentence before we can answer the question, is it Islamophobic? And so I devised 5 tests which I didn't argue were decisive in answering that question, but could help us to answer that question, could take us quite a long way. Now, I may not be able to remember all 5 tests, but here's a few of them anyway. First question is it generalizing about Muslims, or is it trying to find a specific target, like these particular Muslims, or this particular book that I read, or this television program, or whatever? Because if it's generalizing about Muslims, then it's likely to be Islamophobic, because Muslims are a highly diverse bunch of people, and some Muslims would even agree with that proposition, others wouldn't, and so on. So that's one test. Does it uncritically generalize about Muslims? Another test is it being offered as part of a dialogue that Muslims can join, or is it about Muslims? Because one of the things I'd say about Britain, where we certainly have plenty of Islamophobia, especially in the last few years, is that actually we do have Muslims able to play quite a significant role in the national conversation about Muslims and Islamophobia. And I contrast that with France, where we have loads of discourse, perhaps even much more than in Britain, about Muslims and Islam, but Muslims and Islam are hardly part of that conversation, because it's about Muslims, not with Muslims. So I think Islamophobia is where non-Muslims tell Muslims, this is what you are, and it's not dialogical. And if it is dialogical, one of the tests of a dialogue is it a vehicle for mutual criticism? Because if only one side is criticizing the other, that's not dialogue. That's being lectured at, hectored at, or, some form of racialization. So that's another test of Islamophobia. Will you be satisfied with 2 for the time being? But I do have 5, and they're to be found in, you can download the article online from the British Academy Journal. I'm just trying to think what its name is. But if you just typed in British Academy, Modood, Islamophobia, I'm sure it would take you to the relevant article where I do have 5 tests. And I'm very pleased to say that they have been taken up by the Parliament at Westminster, a parliamentary group, and made part of the national definition of Islamophobia. What I'm less pleased to tell you is that the government failed to take up that definition. But you may be aware that we're very likely to have a new government by the end of the week. And I think they're very likely to take up my 5 tests as part of a definition of Islamophobia. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed for you as well. So maybe I will just push the envelope slightly further, because we talk about, a dialogical thing when it comes to these types of things, right? So, even in Singapore, we do have people talking about their experiences, being discriminated against and things like that. And the more sensitive stuff where people share their pain or, what other groups have done to them. So people talk about a safe space to discuss these types of things, or even a brave space because they have to take the courage to talk about them. In your opinion, what kind of conditions would be good to create such spaces where people can talk and have dialogue rather than talk about some other group?
Well, obviously, groups of people have networks, sometimes growing out of friendships and so on, or neighborhood locations, sometimes more formal associations. They're obviously a very good place. I suppose the question arises, should, say, a university or a workplace, like a government department, like Ministry of Home Affairs, for instance, where one might work, should it encourage its employees to form what we sometimes call autonomous groups for exactly this space. So certainly my university does it, and quite a lot do. My trade union does it, and a trade union argues that employers should do it. So I think that is a place it can be done, but I see that it's not very well attended. So you then just have a little bit of a bubble where people who already share a certain point of view are just talking to each other about it, which, you know, has its place. I'm not saying that should never happen. It is good to have a little bit of self-confirmation at times. But I like a little bit more cut and thrust. I like cutting and thrusting myself, so I have to also expose myself to other people's cut and thrust. So maybe I've got a little bit more confidence than I can imagine a lot of other people might have, especially in the early stages where they're exploring these kinds of experiences of victimization, or they may be in a more vulnerable workplace. So yeah, I think employers should offer those kinds of opportunities for autonomous groups or safe space conversations. But I think the ideas are much more likely to be developed in larger associations than in small pockets. But nevertheless, we explore those ideas in smaller groups, don't we? So the larger ideas are much more likely to be developed, say, in a black workers group, which might be a whole citywide group or a regional group or a national group. But of course, some of those may then be picked up and discussed and refined and so on in a particular workplace. So I think we should have those safe space opportunities, but I don't think that's where we will get the most interesting analyses and developments and solutions about the issues we're interested in.
Okay, so a different space for a different purpose.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we move on slightly. Oh, there's someone there. Okay, after this lady, I will take a question from the online, because I see quite a few coming up. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Juliana, and I'm the founder of Lepak Conversations. And we basically use Instagram as a platform to facilitate discussions about Malay-Muslim issues. So I'm just building on what you mentioned earlier, and many speakers today have talked about technology and social media as a risk and threat to ethnic hostility. And as someone who runs the platform, I do have a team, I think we realize that youths, and actually generally, we find that people use the online space to talk about racial issues, and I think it's just going to be a natural thing. I'm just wondering if at different levels of society, be it in school, institutions, at the government level, are we ready to support online spaces to be spaces, safe spaces for discourse instead of controlling it? And I can share what works for us. We act as a moderator, an online moderator. So we actually have terms and conditions on our Instagram page. We monitor comments. We urge people who engage with our content to be respectful. So if there are any hate speech, we actually delete it. So we recognize that there is a potential to use social media for good, because social media is usually seen as like that, it gets bad rap. So I'm just again wondering if at different levels of society we are ready to support social media as a platform for discourse on racial issues.
Thank you. And thank you for asking this face to face.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're doing is very worthwhile, without a doubt. But I'm not sure what support you're looking for. You said, is something or the other, or somebody other, ready to support such spaces? What support do you need?
I think my question is really, it comes from the place that social media is seen as a space that needs to be controlled. So in Singapore, there are laws to control conversations online. So on the alternative, are we ready to support that? And I think earlier the speaker from One People SG said that they equip people from the community to have these conversations offline. But can we do the same and train members of society to have those respectful conversations online?
Yes, I see. Okay, well, I don't know enough about Singapore's laws, but I suppose I got some hint of that from the minister's speech this morning. I'm not sure I can directly address that in any detail, but I'll tell you something which people may or may not think is a good idea. I think social media can be so helpful. I mean, just online and exchange of ideas and so on can be so helpful, without a doubt. But we also know that it can be very toxic. I mean, it's obvious that the amount of racism online is, or misogyny, for instance, is so much greater than in any other sphere of society. Because people feel safe to say the worst things, and not just about groups in general, but about particular individuals. Like, we have a black woman, Labour politician, very senior politician called Diane Abbott. The amount of abuse that she's had, the terrible things that she's had to face online, is absolutely ghastly. And we do have some incitement to hatred laws, but they don't get enough traction with online. But anyway, the recommendation I was going to make, and it's based on my own practice, so you may or may not think it's a good idea, but I've become very concerned over the last few years about how our social media, and I use social media quite a lot, actually, so if you do as well, and you want to refer to this conversation, tag me and I'll repost it or respond. Facebook and X is what I mainly use. But I've become concerned that when I get up in the morning or whatever, read my post, my news feed and so on, it's all the same. And I like it. I'm liking it, reposting it and so on. And then after a while, it just struck me, hang on a minute, there's loads of other people who think other things. And I'm just not hearing those views, except, occasionally, on the television or in a newspaper. So a year or so ago, I deliberately started subscribing, this means paying money, to some right-wing opinion outlets, not belonging to political parties or anything like that, just, they're fairly intellectual, sort of semi-intellectual at the very least. And I sometimes even learned something from them. On the whole, I didn't like them. And I got to confess that yesterday I stopped subscription to one of them because I'd got just so fed up. And the other one, I'm just marking the time till the end of the subscription period. I'm not going to renew it. So even though I'm kind of recommending we should do that, it is quite difficult to hear views you radically disagree with. But on the whole, it's even worse to not even know much about those views and to think actually everybody's agreeing with you on all this. All sensible people are agreeing with you. And so it's, you get into the idea that all sensible people think roughly what I do, or some of them are a bit to my left, and the racists, they're all extreme over there. But actually there's a whole spectrum of opinion, and I felt I needed to hear more, so what one might call center-right reasoned opinion. And nowadays, of course, because we don't tend to read print newspapers and so on, I thought, well, I must subscribe to some center-right intellectual magazines. So my recommendation would be, and this has nothing to do with Singapore and its laws, is that we ought to be very conscious of the bubbles that social media holds us in, and it is a kind of intellectual imprisonment and an intellectual degradation, and we should find ways out of that. My way is not perfect, and it does cost some money, but do make an effort to find out what other people think about the issues that matter to you.
Indeed, it is better and much nicer for a day to hear things that you agree with, right? So we are nearing the end of our session, but I would really like to squeeze the time we have now. So I'm going to combine two of the top voted questions together from online. I apologize if I have wrongly summarized whatever is here, but it's both about racial and identity politics. So the first is really about the war in Gaza, which some people have said that there's a racialization of this issue. So how do we actually try to de-racialize such political issues, as well as, you know, a lot of, there has been some phenomenon recently seeing the far-right rise of political parties who are far-right in different countries. And these political parties also utilize identity politics. So do you think this will continue, and how can societies resist such a movement? Basically, both moving away from identity politics.
Yeah. Okay, so I better be careful what I say, given what the minister said this morning. I do need to leave the country in a couple of days' time.
So we talk about identity politics.
So, but what is interesting is, so I saw the question on the screen in front of me, the first question about how to de-racialize the question about people's views on Gaza. So I don't know about universities in Singapore, but my university, Bristol University, we have a student encampment protesting against the genocide in Gaza, asking our university to divest any investments in companies that do business with Israel, and asking our university not to have research relationships with companies that produce armaments that can be sold, are sold to the Israeli government and so on. So even if you don't have that in Singapore, you'll certainly know about it internationally. And of course, especially in the United States, where I think they've had 70 or more campuses with serious encampments, some of them been lasting now a number of months. Now, what is really interesting is if you look at that, if you look at those encampments, including my own in Bristol, but all the others as well, across so many major universities in major cities and so on, they are very multi-ethnic. They're not all brown people. And a lot of them are very Jewish. And how do I know that? Not because they've got hooked noses and so on, but because they got placards saying, as a Jew, such and such an organization does not speak in my name. As a descendant of a Holocaust survivor, I can't tolerate what's happening in Gaza, not in my name and so on. So actually, there are issues and causes that do become racialized. That is entirely true and entirely wrong. But I actually don't think Gaza is one of these issues. I think that young people in so many countries, certainly the countries that I see on the television news and in my social media, have really been activated, mobilized on this issue. It's more a generational thing than a racial thing. So, so I don't think it is a racialized issue.
Yes, so perhaps we are looking at a different paradigm instead of racialization, right? So do you think identity politics will continue in the societies where we already see this trend?
Yeah, I hope so. So identity politics obviously got itself a very bad name. So has multiculturalism. So I'm in favor of both. So one of the ways that people, critics, opponents, destroy an idea is by caricaturizing it and then making sure that the name sticks to the caricature. So if you ask people in Britain and so many other countries, what is multiculturalism? Now, a lot of people will say things like, it's about separatism, separate communities. It's about ghettos, it's about segregation, and so on. Well, have you ever come across a single self-professed multiculturalist who says, I'm in favor of segregation? I haven't. I'm a multiculturalist, and my multiculturalism has always been about inclusion, about respectful inclusion. So what is this multiculturalism that we're all supposed to be against? It's not what multiculturalists hold, it's what anti-multiculturalists think is multiculturalism and have managed to persuade other people is multiculturalism. And that, to some extent, shows you the relative powerlessness of multiculturalists, that they can't even get their own concept defined in their own way. Imagine if feminism was defined not by feminists, but by anti-feminists. Well, yeah, we'd all be against feminism. So I think this is what's happened to multiculturalism and identity politics, that it's been defined by people who are against it, and they're very powerful, and they've managed to succeed in, firstly, in caricaturizing it, and secondly, in popularizing the caricature, so that everybody, including the politicians who are, the center-left politicians who are fighting to get elected this Thursday in Britain, they won't use the term multiculturalism, they won't use the term identity politics, and if they do, they'll use it critically by saying, of course, I'm not in favor of identity politics, but, and they can't say the positive thing that they're in favor of without first saying, I'm not against I'm against identity politics. If you like, that is the tax that they must pay for saying anything positive about multiculturalism, by not calling it multiculturalism. So that really annoys me, as I'm sure you can pick up. I feel I've been writing about multiculturalism for 25, 30 years. I'm still in favor of it, but other people are telling me what's wrong with multiculturalism and not even referring to the ideas of multiculturalists.
Perhaps we need some education about these terms first, right? So maybe we can think about talking about defining these terms more, conceptually strongly before we go even to these conversations.
Yeah, well, you could start by reading some of my work, yeah.
Definitely. So, and with that, I think we can conclude the session. I think we have learned quite a bit today, and we thank you very much for Prof. Tariq for sharing his wisdom with us. Thank you very much for joining us today.